12 Hollywood stars who hid their black heritage. Shocking revelations. What if some of Hollywood's most familiar faces carried a story the industry didn't always want front and center? Behind the glamour, red carpets and iconic roles lies a quieter history. One where black heritage was sometimes softened, blurred, or strategically downplayed to fit the screen of its time. These aren't tales of denial, but of survival image control, and a system that often decided how identity should look. Today, we're pulling back that curtain. Before we begin, make sure you like, subscribe, and join us on Legends of Black Excellence, where history, truth, and legacy finally get the spotlight they deserve. Merle Oberon. Long before Hollywood began openly discussing identity, Merle Oberon was living one of its most carefully guarded secrets. On screen, she embodied the elegance of classic cinema, luminous skin-refined accent, and the poise of a woman seemingly born into European sophistication. Her performance as Kathy in Wuthering Heights 1939 sealed her place among Hollywood's elite. But behind the studio lighting and polished publicity stills was a reality far more complicated. Oberon was born in British India and had South Asian heritage with family roots tracing back to Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon. At a time when even a whisper of non-white ancestry could end a career, that truth was considered dangerous. Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s operated on rigid racial hierarchies, both spoken and unspoken. Studios didn't just promote stars, they manufactured them, biographies included. For Merle Oberon, that meant constructing a carefully edited origin story that presented her as European. Her mother was publicly described in ways that avoided racial classification, and details about her early life were blurred or altered. This wasn't vanity, it was survival. One rumor, one investigative reporter digging too deeply, could have shut every studio door overnight. If your life's dream depended on the world never knowing where you truly came from, would you risk telling the truth? That was the quiet tension she carried through premieres, interviews, and award seasons. The pressure to pass shaped not only her public image but her private life. Friends noted her reluctance to discuss childhood memories, and she maintained emotional distance from parts of her past. The psychological weight of guarding such a secret in an industry built on exposure must have been immense. Yet on screen, none of that strain showed. Audiences saw only grace romance and classic star power. That contrast between inner vigilance and outward glamour reflects the reality many multiracial performers faced in early Hollywood. Success required invisibility of a different kind, erasing parts of oneself so completely that even the mirror reflected the studio's version. Only after her death did the fuller story of Merle Oberon's background become widely known. By then, the world had begun to change slowly, opening conversations about race, identity, and belonging that her generation never had the freedom to explore. Her legacy now carries a dual meaning. She remains a symbol of Hollywood's golden age beauty, but also a reminder of the personal costs hidden beneath that glow. Merle Oberon didn't hide her heritage out of shame. She hid it because the era she lived in gave her little choice. Understanding that truth doesn't diminish her legend, it deepens it, revealing the human courage behind the polished myth. Rashida Jones. Rashida Jones's story sits at a quiet crossroads in Hollywood, not a tale of dramatic concealment, but of identity that often went unseen. Born to music legend Quincy Jones, one of the most influential black producers in American history, and actress Peggy Lipton. A white television star, Rashida grew up surrounded by culture, art, and history from both sides of America's racial landscape. Yet when she appeared on screen in shows like The Office and Parks and Recreation, most viewers didn't immediately connect her to that heritage. Her roles were written without racial framing, and her look led many to assume she was simply white. In an industry that once exaggerated racial difference, her experience reveals how easily heritage can fade into the background when it doesn't match expectation. Unlike performers from earlier Hollywood eras, who faced direct studio pressure to hide their backgrounds, Rashida's experience reflects a more modern but still complex reality. She has spoken about growing up feeling between worlds, aware of her Black identity, but also conscious that others did not always recognize it. Hollywood often relies on visual shorthand, and when someone doesn't fit a clear category nuance, tends to disappear. That invisibility can shape how a career unfolds, not through restriction, but through omission. For Rashida, it meant moving through the industry without the cultural framing that typically surrounds actresses visibly identified as Black in America. Her career path further highlights this subtle dynamic. Rather than being cast in roles built around race, Rashida established herself through intelligent, grounded performances. She became known for her natural humor, warmth, and relatability qualities that resonated widely but rarely sparked public conversation about her family roots. Meanwhile, her father's towering legacy in Black music history remained a separate narrative in the public imagination. The contrast is striking: a cultural giant whose work shaped generations and a daughter whose connection to that heritage often went unmentioned. This is not a story of denial, but of how Hollywood's lens can blur identity just as easily as it once tried to reshape it. Rashida Jones represents a generational shift in how race and identity appear on screen. Her presence challenges the idea that heritage must look a certain way to be acknowledged. Today's audiences are more open to conversations about multiracial experiences, yet her journey reminds us that visibility isn't only about appearance, it's about recognition and understanding. She stands as proof that identity can be deeply rooted even when it isn't loudly labeled. In an industry built on image, Rashida's story shows how the most complex truths are sometimes the quietest ones, waiting to be noticed beyond first impressions. Meghan Markle. Before she became the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle was known to television audiences as Rachel Zane on the legal drama Suits. On screen, she fit the image of the polished, modern, professional woman, confident, articulate, and visually aligned with Hollywood's long-favored mainstream look. Yet Meghan's background tells a broader story. Her mother, Doria Ragland, is a Black woman, and Meghan has often described herself as biracial, growing up navigating spaces where she sometimes felt she didn't fully belong to one side or the other. That dual heritage shaped her worldview long before royal headlines ever did. In the entertainment industry, appearance has always influenced opportunity. Meghan has spoken about audition rooms where casting directors struggled to categorize her, a familiar experience for many multiracial actors. Rather than being marketed around racial identity, her early career often positioned her in roles where race was not central to the character's story. This created an image some viewers interpreted as white passing, not because she denied her heritage, but because Hollywood frequently defaults to visual simplicity when presenting actors to broad audiences. That subtle framing can make heritage feel secondary, even when it is deeply personal. Meghan herself has addressed these dynamics, recalling moments in her youth when forms asked her to check a single racial box, forcing choices that never fully represented who she was. As her public profile grew, especially after her relationship with Prince Harry became known, conversations about race media portrayal and identity followed closely. She spoke openly about her experiences with racial bias in the press, bringing visibility to discussions many multiracial individuals have had privately for years. Her story moved from Hollywood casting challenges to global conversations about how society perceives race, class, and belonging. Meghan Markle's journey reflects a modern chapter in the same long narrative. Identity in the public eye is often shaped as much by perception as by truth. Unlike earlier eras where heritage was hidden out of fear, her experience highlights how background can be overlooked until the world suddenly decides it matters. From cable television to royal life, Meghan's path shows how multiracial identity can exist in plain sight even when people don't immediately recognize it. Zoe Saldana. Zoe Saldana has long represented the global multicultural face of modern Hollywood. Born to a Dominican father and a Puerto Rican mother with Haitian roots in her family history, she identifies as a Black Latina, a heritage shaped by the African diaspora in the Caribbean. On screen, she became a sci-fi icon through Avatar: Guardians of the Galaxy and Star Trek, often playing characters whose identity wasn't tied to race at all. Her look allowed her to move across genres and markets, making her one of the highest-grossing actresses in film history. But that same versatility later placed her at the center of a sensitive cultural debate. The controversy erupted when she was cast as legendary singer and civil rights figure Nina Simone. Simone was known not only for her voice, but for her deep brown skin, broad features, and outspoken connection to Black identity and colorism. Critics argued that casting a lighter-skinned actress and using makeup and prosthetics to darken her appearance ignored the lived experience tied to Simone's look. Many felt the decision reflected Hollywood's long pattern of favoring actors who fit more acceptable beauty standards, even when portraying historical Black figures whose appearance carried cultural meaning. Saldana later acknowledged the backlash, saying she wished Nina Simone had been portrayed by someone whose physical presence more closely matched the icons. Her response showed how the conversation had shifted from earlier Hollywood eras. Instead of hiding identity, the debate centered on representation, colorism, and who gets to tell certain stories. It wasn't about denying Zoe Saldana's Black heritage, it was about whether proximity to Eurocentric features gave her access to opportunities others might not receive. Her experience highlights a modern layer of the industry's racial history. The issue is no longer only about erasure, but about nuance within identity itself. Skin tone, visibility, and cultural context. Zoe Saldana remains a major figure in global cinema, but the Nina Simone debate became part of a broader reckoning about how Hollywood handles race history and responsibility on screen. Thandie Newton. Thandie Newton, known earlier in her career as Thandie Newton, represents another deeply personal chapter in Hollywood's evolving conversation about race and identity. Born to a Zimbabwean mother of Shona heritage and a white British father, she grew up moving between cultures, languages, and expectations. That dual background gave her a rich sense of identity, but in the film industry, complexity is often reduced to marketing labels. Early in her career, Newton was frequently described as exotic, a term Hollywood has long used when it doesn't quite know how to categorize someone racially, but still wants to package them as visually intriguing. She has spoken candidly about the emotional toll of that framing. Instead of openly acknowledging her as a Black woman of African descent, some roles and publicity narratives emphasized ambiguity over clarity. The word exotic can sound flattering on the surface, yet it often strips away heritage, turning culture into aesthetic rather than lived experience. For Newton, this created a sense of being seen and unseen, at the same time visible for her beauty, but not always fully recognized in her identity. Over time, she pushed back against that narrative, choosing to speak more directly about her Zimbabwean roots and her connection to Black womanhood. Her decision to reclaim the original spelling of her name Thandie was part of that journey. She explained that Thandie had been a misspelling early in her career, that she felt pressured to accept a small but symbolic example of how the industry can reshape identity to fit convenience. Restoring her name was more than a correction. It was an act of cultural grounding, reconnecting her public self with her family history. That step resonated widely, especially with audiences who understood how names carry ancestry, language, and memory. Thandie Newton's story reflects a shift from quiet adaptation to open self-definition. Rather than allowing Hollywood to blur her background into a vague image, she has chosen to articulate it on her own terms. Her career spanning dramas, action films, and award-winning television shows that authenticity and success no longer have to stand in opposition. In an industry still learning to embrace full identity, her voice has become part of a broader movement toward recognition rather than reduction. Paula Patton. Paula Patton built her Hollywood presence through roles defined more by story than by racial framing. Yet her background tells a layered story about identity in the industry. Her father is black, and her mother is white, giving her a multiracial heritage that has often shaped how she is perceived on screen. In films like Mission Impossible, Ghost Protocol, and Deja Vu, Patton played characters whose narratives were not centered on race, placing her in what Hollywood often labels universal roles, parts written to appeal broadly without cultural specificity. That positioning reflects a familiar pattern for actresses whose appearance doesn't immediately place them into a single racial category in the public mind. Rather than being cast in roles that explore Black identity or African American cultural themes, Patton has frequently been chosen for parts where race is left unspoken. This can create the impression of being white-passing to some viewers, even though her heritage is clear and she has spoken about being proud of her background. It's less about hiding identity and more about how the industry frames it or chooses not to. Hollywood's tendency to treat multiracial performers as racially flexible can open doors while also narrowing representation in subtler ways. Being seen as adaptable allows access to big-budget franchises and mainstream genres, but it can also mean fewer opportunities to portray stories directly connected to one's cultural roots. Patton's career sits in that balance, visible, successful, and widely recognized, yet not often discussed in conversations about Black actresses despite her lineage. Paula Patton's path illustrates a modern shift in how race operates on screen. Earlier eras forced concealment. Today, identity can be present but understated, acknowledged privately more than publicly. Her body of work shows how Hollywood increasingly casts talent based on global market appeal, sometimes smoothing out cultural detail in the process. In that space, heritage doesn't disappear. It simply isn't always foregrounded, leaving audiences to look a little closer to see the full picture. Eartha Kitt. Eartha Kitt was never easy to place in a single box, and that was part of her power. A singer with a voice like velvet and steel, a stage presence that could command any room, and an actress remembered by many as Catwoman in the 1960s, Batman series Kitt carried her Black identity with unmistakable pride. Born in the segregated South to a mother of African and Cherokee descent, she rose from hardship to international stardom through sheer talent and determination. Her elegance, multilingual performances, and global appeal sometimes led media to frame her as worldly and exotic, but her roots in Black America were never truly hidden. Still, the industry often highlighted glamour while softening the social reality behind it. During certain phases of her career, publicity focused more on her sophistication and European success than on her connection to the Black experience in the United States. That subtle shift didn't erase her heritage, but it sometimes pushed it to the background in favor of marketable mystique. Kitt, however, was not someone who stayed quiet for comfort. She spoke openly about inequality, dignity, and the responsibility of artists to have a voice beyond entertainment. That courage came with consequences. In 1968, at a White House luncheon, Eartha Kitt criticized the Vietnam War and spoke about the emotional toll it was taking on young Americans. The backlash was swift. Invitations disappeared, work in the U.S. slowed dramatically, and she was effectively blacklisted from major Hollywood projects for years. Yet instead of fading, she took her talent abroad, continuing to perform and build an international career. Her outspokenness cost her in the short term, but it also cemented her legacy as an artist who valued truth over approval. Eartha Kitt's story stands at the intersection of race artistry and activism. Her Black identity was never something she denied, but the industry sometimes found it easier to celebrate her style than her substance. Over time, recognition caught up with her resilience, and she returned to American screens with renewed respect. Today, she is remembered not only as a performer of rare charisma, but as a woman who refused to separate her talent from her convictions, proof that authenticity can outlast exclusion. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most electrifying entertainers of the 20th century. A singer, dancer, actor, impressionist, and a core member of the Rat Pack alongside Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. But behind the tuxedo, the spotlight, and the effortless charm was a man navigating an industry that demanded polish, while quietly resisting his full identity. As a black performer rising in the segregated era of American entertainment, Davis entered a world where talent opened doors, but race still set the terms of entry. Early in his career, image management was part of survival. Studios, promoters, and venues often shaped how he was presented, smoothing edges and emphasizing sophistication to make him more acceptable to white mainstream audiences. This didn't mean denying who he was, but it did mean constantly balancing authenticity with opportunity. He performed in elite clubs where he could entertain on stage but was sometimes barred from staying in the same hotels as white colleagues. The contradiction was stark, celebrated under the lights, restricted once they dimmed. Yet Davis never allowed those limits to define the scale of his ambition. His versatility made him impossible to ignore. He could move from Broadway to Las Vegas, from film sets to television specials, carrying a level of showmanship that transcended genre. Over time, his sheer excellence pushed back against the barriers meant to contain him. His friendships within the Rat Pack, particularly Sinatra's public support, helped challenge some industry norms, even if it didn't erase prejudice entirely. Davis became a symbol of breakthrough not because the system welcomed him, but because he forced it to expand. Sammy Davis Jr.'s legacy is about more than entertainment. It's about visibility during a time when visibility itself was a statement. He operated in a space where every appearance carried social weight, where being seen as a black star in mainstream America quietly reshaped expectations. The pressures to refine, adjust, and fit never fully disappeared, but neither did his identity. In the end, he didn't just cross racial barriers, he performed on top of them, turning the stage into a place where talent and resilience spoke louder than restriction. Logan Browning. Logan Browning represents a newer generation of actresses navigating identity in an industry still learning how to talk about it honestly. Known widely for Dear White People, she is multiracial and identifies as a black woman, yet her appearance has often led casting directors to place her in roles described as ambiguous or simply light-skinned. That label might sound neutral, but it reflects a long-standing Hollywood habit of softening racial specificity when a performer doesn't fit a narrow visual stereotype. Browning has spoken openly about colorism, the subtle and not-so-subtle preference for lighter skin within and beyond the industry. She's pointed out how this dynamic shapes opportunity, visibility, and even the kinds of stories that get told. Being cast as racially undefined can bring steady work, but it can also blur cultural identity, making heritage feel optional in narratives where it should be meaningful. For an actress who values representation, that tension isn't abstract. It's personal and professional at the same time. Her role in Dear White People became especially significant because the series directly addressed race perception and the politics of appearance on a predominantly white campus. It gave Browning space to portray a character within a story that acknowledged nuance rather than avoiding it. Off-screen, she has continued those conversations, emphasizing that diversity isn't just about counting faces, it's about recognizing the wide spectrum of black identity, including those who don't fit a single look. Logan Browning's journey shows how the conversation has shifted from silence to self-definition. Instead of accepting ambiguity as a marketing tool, she has helped turn it into dialogue about fairness, visibility, and authenticity. Her career illustrates a modern reality. Identity in Hollywood isn't always hidden outright, but it can be reframed in ways that feel incomplete. By naming those patterns, she contributes to a broader push for representation that reflects lived experience, not just surface appearance. Boris Kodjoe. Boris Kodjoe has long had the kind of screen presence Hollywood loves: tall, polished, multilingual, and effortlessly charismatic. Born to a Ghanaian father and a German mother, he grew up between cultures carrying a heritage that is clearly black, yet often framed in the industry as international or exotic. That description has followed him through much of his career, subtly shaping how he is cast and how audiences are encouraged to see him. In films like Love and Basketball and Surrogates, Kodjoe frequently appears in roles where race is not central to the storyline. These universal parts can signal broad appeal, placing him in narratives designed to travel across markets without focusing on cultural specificity. While that versatility highlights his range, it also reflects a familiar Hollywood pattern. Multiracial or globally identifiable actors are often positioned in ways that smooth out racial detail rather than exploring it directly. The result is visibility, but sometimes without the depth of representation tied to Black-led storytelling. The label exotic may sound flattering, yet it carries the same ambiguity many actors of mixed heritage describe. It suggests difference without definition, style without story. Kojo's background, rooted in West Africa and Europe, is rich with history, but that complexity isn't always foregrounded on screen. Instead, he's often cast as the charming professional, the romantic interest, or the polished authority figure roles that emphasize presence over cultural context. Still, Kojo's career reflects a broader shift in how identity operates in mainstream entertainment. Earlier eras forced performers to conceal or downplay heritage. Today, identity can be visible yet understated, acknowledged, without being central. His path shows both the progress and the limits of that evolution. He stands as a recognizable Black actor in major productions, even if Hollywood doesn't always write his background into the script. In that space between global marketability and cultural specificity, Boris Kodjoe's journey highlights an ongoing conversation about who gets to carry identity on screen and how fully it's allowed to be seen. Wentworth Miller. Wentworth Miller became a global television star with the intense, controlled performance that made Prison Break a phenomenon. Viewers around the world knew his face, his voice, and the quiet intelligence he brought to the role of Michael Scofield. What many didn't immediately know was the complexity of his background. Miller was born to a Black father with African American and Jamaican roots, along with European ancestry, and a white mother of European descent. His heritage placed him within the Black diaspora, yet his appearance led many audiences and industry decision-makers to read him differently at first glance. Early in his career, Hollywood largely framed him without racial context. He was cast in roles where identity was neutral, unstated, or simply not part of the storyline. This positioning wasn't unusual for actors whose features don't fit narrow visual expectations of race. Instead of being introduced through a cultural lens, he was presented as universally marketable, polished intellectual, and emotionally contained. That framing opened major doors, but it also meant that a key part of who he was rarely entered the public conversation. Heritage existed in reality, while on screen it remained background rather than narrative. Miller has spoken thoughtfully about identity, belonging, and the internal side of navigating multiple worlds. Growing up, he was aware of difference, of not fitting neatly into categories that society often prefers to keep simple. That awareness followed him into adulthood and into an industry that frequently reads appearance before listening to personal history. His experience reflects a broader pattern. When someone doesn't match a stereotype, their background can become invisible rather than openly acknowledged. It's not concealment in the dramatic sense of old Hollywood secrets, but a quieter form of omission shaped by perception. Over time, the conversation around identity in entertainment has shifted, and Miller's story sits within that evolution. Audiences today are more interested in the full picture behind public figures, and artists themselves speak more openly about heritage and lived experience. His career shows how success once depended on fitting into a streamlined image, while the present moment allows more room for nuance. Wentworth Miller stands as an example of how identity can be present even when not highlighted, and how understanding that complexity adds depth to the people we think we already know from the screen. Mariah Carey. Mariah Carey is known worldwide for her 5-octave voice chart-topping hits and lasting influence on pop and R&B, but her personal story also reflects a deeper conversation about identity in entertainment. She was born to a Black father of African American and Afro-Venezuelan heritage and an Irish American mother. Growing up, she experienced racism firsthand, including hostility directed at her family for being interracial. Those early experiences shaped her sense of self, yet, when her career first exploded in the early 1990s, the industry spotlight focused almost entirely on her vocal talent image and crossover appeal, rather than the complexity of her racial background. In the early phase of her rise, marketing often presented Carey in a way that felt racially neutral to mainstream audiences. The emphasis was on glamour range and commercial sound, positioning her as a global pop figure whose identity did not need definition. At a time when the industry still carefully managed how artists were introduced to wide audiences, that framing helped her break records across multiple charts. But it also meant many casual listeners didn't fully understand her Black heritage or the cultural influences behind her music, especially as she moved between pop and R&B spaces. As her career evolved, Carey became more open about her experiences with race belonging and feeling caught between worlds while growing up. She has spoken about not always being fully accepted by either side of her background and about the emotional weight of that in childhood. Over the years, she increasingly embraced and articulated her connection to Black culture collaborators and musical traditions, helping shape modern R&B pop crossover in the process. Her story shows how identity in the spotlight can shift from something quietly present to something openly acknowledged and personally defined. Mariah Carey's journey illustrates a broader industry pattern. Heritage was not denied, but it wasn't always centered either. Early image control often prioritized market reach over cultural clarity. Today, her legacy includes not only vocal brilliance, but also the fuller narrative of who she is and where she comes from. In looking back, audiences can see how the person behind the voice carried more history than the early spotlight revealed, a reminder that talent may be what the world first applauds, but identity is the story that endures. Hollywood has long shaped how Black identity appears on screen, sometimes celebrating it, sometimes softening it, and sometimes packaging it as universal exotic or racially ambiguous. From classic-era stars who felt pressure to blend into modern actors navigating colorism and global market appeal, these stories reveal how talent often had to travel through the narrow gate of perception. Yet heritage never truly disappears. It lives beneath the roles, the lights, and the labels. As audiences, we now see more, but are we truly recognizing identity, or just accepting a new version of invisibility wrapped in progress?